there are familiar faces and then also people that may be here for the first time at the Women Who Stay series. So I just want to extend a warm welcome. I'm so glad you found it, and please come back. We have been offering this series. Myself, I'm Liz McCluskey, and wonderful fellow parishioner and lay leader Ann Kester. We've been offering this with the support of Holy Trinity and now Ashley and the Social Justice Ministry for 2 years. And we have been looking at, from a feminist perspective, women in the Bible. Tonight we're going to do something a little different, still highlighting biblical women, but not women in the Bible. So we always like to begin our sessions with a prayer. And this evening, Holy Trinity parishioner Bill Plant is going to lead us in opening prayer. And among other things, such as having been a very revered White House correspondent, Bill, who's sitting next to Robin, is also her husband, dear husband. So if you would open us in prayer, Bill.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I've been asked to read the peace prayer. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Thank you, Bill. That's a perfect prayer to start off our summer session because, as I said, we're still looking at biblical women, but they're not women in the Bible. They're women inspired by their faith to bring love where there's hatred, hope where there's despair. And we're doubly blessed because we're also, when we're highlighting these women, we're also highlighting the women who tell their stories, who themselves are women who stay and who pursue justice and healing. And then we're triply blessed because tonight we're going to hear from a Holy Trinity sister, Robin Smith. So I know most of you probably know Robin, but for anybody who doesn't, Robin and Bill have been parishioners at Holy Trinity for over 20 years. Robin went through the RCIA program there, and they are incredibly generous about bringing their time and their talent to the Holy Trinity community, and they've had such a wonderful impact there and also beyond, as we shall see. So just a little bit about Robin, if you do not know. She has a master's in film from Boston University. She was a producer for CBS before, in 1985, in New York, coming to Washington to start her life here, and found an organization called Video Action. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that with Robin, but having established quite a reputation for impactful films about various nonprofits, the Faith and Politics Institute reached out to Robin to create a short film, promoting its work. So Robin asked me to give a little context about the Faith and Politics Institute so we can dive right into conversation about the filmmaking itself. So the Faith and Politics Institute tries to bridge the divides of race, party, and religion among members of Congress. So they have a big job. I don't think they'll ever run out of funding because of that. Always be a need for that role. But what they do, the Faith and Politics Institute, is offer programs to members of Congress, and it aims to both speak to and invite members of Congress to speak from the heart, to tap their passion for justice and truth that led them into public life to begin with, and to inspire them to dig down deep out of that faith. So one of the programs offered is an annual civil rights pilgrimage. It's led by Congressman John Lewis of Atlanta, Georgia, and it takes members to Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma, Alabama. And it began as just an offhanded invitation from John Lewis to a fellow, a colleague in the House, a Republican named Amo Houghton. Amo asked what he was doing that weekend. He said, I'm going to the anniversary of the Bloody Sunday when we marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And he said, would you like to come? So Amo Houghton came, and that started a beautiful partnership that led to an annual pilgrimage that the Faith and Politics Institute would lead. And it is an incredibly powerful, transformative experience for those who attend the pilgrimage. You hear stories of those involved in the civil rights events. And it touches upon the deep faith of the civil rights leaders, as well as the members of Congress and all those accompanying them to the pilgrimage. And I know it's powerful because I made this pilgrimage myself 4 times. I was the president of the Faith and Politics Institute for a time, and I can attest that many times there was not a dry eye among members. I was able to witness the Montgomery, Alabama Chief Police apologize to Congressman John Lewis 50 years after the police purposefully stayed away as the Freedom Riders rolled into town and then were brutally assaulted. So he apologized on behalf of the police. And I can tell you that many members of Congress were there, including the House and the House Republican and House Democrat, the leads and the highest office in those, and they were both crying. So it's a powerful, powerful trip. And I first met Robin and Bill in 2015 when it was the 50th anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the passing of the Voting Rights Act. And you remember, Robin and Bill, that President Obama and Michelle Obama, as well as George and Laura Bush, were there at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and over 100 members of Congress. It was incredibly powerful. So that was not Robin's first pilgrimage. That was 10 years after her first pilgrimage. And so what we're going to do is Robin and I are going to have a conversation. And I would love to begin, Robin, with your pilgrimage to the pilgrimage. So I want to know a little bit about how you got into filmmaking, just to begin with, because it seems like that's a thread that carries throughout.
Oh, wow. Okay. So when I went to film school in Boston, I decided that for my thesis film, I would do something very, very personal. I would tell the story of what it felt like to be the daughter of a man who went missing in Vietnam. I was 19 years old when my father, who was a colonel in the Marine Corps, when his plane literally disappeared. And so it was a number of years later that I was in film school, and I thought, I'm just going to tackle the subject. I'm going to try to tell my own story. It was going to be a subjective, objective documentary. Remember, you're in graduate school, so you can do whatever you want. And I used the filmmaking process as a way to really dig deep, and it was extraordinary. What I got in touch with in myself through the process. So I made a film called He's Only Missing, and it ended up getting the attention of CBS News, and CBS actually invited me to New York to be a researcher, a summer researcher, and I had no idea that I was going to go into journalism. That wasn't my path. I was going to, raise $500,000 every 6 years and make a film. So this was a little departure, but hey, I did it. So I went to New York, and it was the time when a show called Sunday Morning was just being created. And oh my God, what a gift. Charles Kuralt and I became the very first researcher on that show. I was part of 7 people who launched the show. And I learned that I could satisfy this passion I have for telling authentic stories not by raising $500,000 and spending 6 years doing the film, but with these shorter pieces. So I got very attached to the 8 to the 10-minute storytelling. And when I left New York to move down to Washington to be with Bill and eventually to marry Bill, I reinvented myself and created this company called Video Action, specifically to do these 8 to 10-minute pieces with the not-for-profit community that was making a difference in the lives of other people. So that's the way that I came into it.
Yes, and so for you in your entire adult life, film has been a powerful medium to tell stories, and maybe tell stories of those who don't necessarily have a voice in the nonprofits that you helped. So how did you then get connected to faith and politics? And
well, I had 2 people on my board. Video Action is a not-for-profit organization. 2 people had gone on the pilgrimage, and they said, Robin, faith and politics needs a film. They need their story told. They have no money, and in the not-for-profit world, nobody has any money, so that wasn't a surprise. And so I said, okay, 2005, I'll do this on spec. And I got my favorite camera crew, and we had no idea what we were getting into, right? We just said, okay, we're going to get on the bus and we're going to do this pilgrimage. Well, it's a 3-day pilgrimage in 3 different cities. And because we didn't know really what it was going to be, we were jumping off the bus with everybody else, right? And going into the churches and into the parks and onto the bridge where all of this history had taken place. And what John Lewis did so beautifully is, he was involved in all these little aspects, but he made sure that other people who had been part of the movement were there in the church to help tell the story. And so that's where I first met Dorothy Cotton, who was just an amazing organizer, and music was definitely her thing. But she became one of the presenters, and a number of other people. So John, as this humble man that he is, brought in all these first-person storytellers to tell their own stories, but doing it in the places where it all happened. That was what was so cool about it. Mm-hmm. So we shot for 3 days. We're heading home, and my cameraman turns to me and he said, oh my God, Robin, that was so powerful. I really want my son to experience this, but quite frankly, this is not a short film for faith and politics. You have to do this as a documentary. You have to do this. And I'm like, okay. So I stepped back and thought, I can do this. And, those of you who are familiar with documentary filmmaking, it's labor intensive. You got to spend a lot of time raising money and trying to make things happen. So it was another 2 years before I had more money to be able to actually pay for people to go with me and to shoot the different things. But what ended up happening is I shot the whole pilgrimage in 2005, and then I shot it again in 2007. And many of the same people were presenting, right? Dorothy Cotton was presenting in both places. She had a leopard shirt on in one, and she had a red shirt on in the other, but she was basically doing the same presentation. So I took the content of what they presented and then just wove it together into 1 hour that distills 10 years of the nonviolent struggle. And certainly their stories, the individuals who are telling their stories are a powerful part of it. But this happened to be a time when photojournalists were just kind of finding their legs in terms of storytelling. And it was the pictures, the news footage, but also the still photographs that just brought this movement to the attention of so many people that hadn't a clue what was going on.
So those of us who've seen the film, and hopefully if you haven't, you will soon, saw Dorothy Cotton, who you just mentioned. Tell us a little bit about Dorothy Cotton and her story.
Well, one of the things I loved about her, and she says this clearly in the film, she says, I want you all, when you go home, to not think that Martin Luther King did this all by himself. He didn't. We were all there. And, as a woman, I was wondering, I said, so, how were women treated in the movement at that time? She said, we were not treated very well. I mean, the men thought that we were there to make the coffee, but we showed them that we weren't, that we were really active participants in this. And Dorothy Cotton was an incredible organizer, but she also knew the power of music as an organizing tool, and especially for women. They would come into these churches, which were like sanctuaries, and sing this music together, which would give them like a sense of safety, but also connection to what was going on. And then the business was, handled through what they called mass meetings. But the music was an integral part of it. And I loved it when Dorothy Cotton said, you could tell the whole story of the civil rights movement through the music. And I think you can. So I sort of took that as an idea that in my storytelling, that I would make sure that music was a key piece in each scene. And, in many cases, like Betty Mae Fikes and Dorothy and others would actually sing, and I had the actuality, but I also went to some other sources to get the music, just so that was woven through the entire hour.
And was that the primary way that those civil rights women, their voices were heard during their time through song? Was there
definitely through song?
Mm-hmm.
And also through their actions. I mean, Rosa Parks didn't just suddenly decide she was not going to sit in the back. I mean, she had gone to training, and she had been educated in tactics. And the women were right there on the front lines, doing these social actions that were getting attention and going to prison. I mean, she had her fingerprints taken and was hauled off to prison.
So did you spend much time with Dorothy in the making of the film or after making the film?
No, I wish that I had had more time with each of them. The crafting of the film, unfortunately, is a solitary venture. Dorothy was teaching up in Ithaca. I mean, she was not in the area. But I did make sure that if I was ever invited to do something, to speak about the film or to do something about the issue, that I say, you really should invite Dorothy Cotton to come, and she can tell part of the story. And that was wonderful, just to see her shine in all these different venues.
Mm-hmm. So what impact did you hope to have in making the film?
In the making of the film?
Yeah.
Well, I think when I was making it, I really just wanted to bring the story as vividly to life as I could. And in the course of making it, I realized that the gift that I was giving to the public was the ability to see the connection between the boycott in Montgomery in 1955, and then the lunch counter sit-ins, and then the freedom rides, and then what happened with the March on Washington, and then the kids marching in Birmingham and the hoses, and all this drama. And then for this one decade, the culmination was, of course, the march from Selma to Montgomery. So the gift that I wanted to give was the ability to see how these things were not isolated events, that they weren't just little pieces of history, but it really was a continuum. And the beauty is that John Lewis, was there in all those different parts over the course of that decade and so much longer. So that was one of the gifts. The other thing is I was really fascinated by the role of faith in the movement, and of course the Faith and Politics Institute. That is the story that they tell. I don't know how many people who are here viewing this chat tonight have seen the film that has just been released on John Lewis called Good Trouble. It really is, it's a very, very good film. It's going to have a theatrical release. It tells the story. It uses a lot of the same footage that I put into my film, but it doesn't tell the faith story. It just kind of touches on that. And so I see the film that I've made now as a beautiful companion to this other piece, which I hope is going to get a lot of attention, because it's so much about the faith. John Lewis was a man inspired by and driven by his deep faith. And for me as a filmmaker, when I found that piece of footage where he's 19 years old and he's talking, it's black and white footage, and he's talking to the camera, he's processing, and he's saying, I know I have to love this person who is beating me. How do I do that? And to watch him process that, to me was extraordinary. And also the other thing is, John Lewis and this tale that's in the film, it is the non-violent struggle. I mean, anytime it came up to the point where there were people that wanted a more aggressive approach, John pulled back, John pulled out. He was all about nonviolence. And people often ask me, if it's about nonviolence, why is there so much violence? Why is there all that? Is that the nonviolent tactics drew the hatred out so that it was visible. And when it was visible and it was recorded and then it was shown on the evening news, it was shown in those photographs, you couldn't deny it. It was just a stunning revelation for me to see that action of nonviolence, pulling this out so that it can be seen.
Mm. And the role of faith, I want to talk about in a minute some of the questions people have posed about its relevance for today. And maybe this will be a segue to that. But what did it stir up in you in your own faith life?
When I was doing it or now?
Well, when you were doing it now, and then we can talk about now the role of faith and what's happening now, perhaps.
Well, for me, it was quite a blessing. I mean, you would think editing a film over the course of a year is torture, but no, it's not. I mean, it was quite beautiful. I when I went through RCIA, developed this beautiful habit of going to daily mass. I started it in the period leading up to my confirmation, and it just kind of stuck. And so I would go to the 8 a.m. mass, and something would be said in the gospel or the homily, and I would take that into the edit room with me. And it was such a rich part of what I was doing. I'm telling a story about faith. I'm discovering my own faith. I'm seeing these tangible examples. And it was just this wonderful energy that was constantly going through the process.
That's beautiful that you were coming together like that. We have some questions that people are posing. And so I'm going to ask you some of those, just in the order I'm seeing them. But you talked about John Lewis and the nonviolence, which was such an important component. So John Lewis said in the film that the nonviolence training enabled them to be arrested and imprisoned, and that they lost their sense of fear. I was so touched by this. Can you speak about that? And then I guess this person also says, I'd observed that faith has not been a large part of Black Lives Matter, and wondering, and I'm dovetailing two questions, if you see parallels between what you presented in the film and what is happening today. So it's a two-part question. First, talk about how did they do this? This enabled to not be afraid. Can you speak a little more about that? Maybe if Dorothy shared anything, or John Lewis, and then the question of faith and where it fits in today.
Yeah, I mean, John is very, very clear about it. He was at university in Nashville, and he met the Reverend Jim Lawson, right? I think it's Jim Lawson. And Jim Lawson was holding workshops, nonviolent workshops, to teach these young activists the tactics that they would use, right? And many of them had come from homes where, their parents would say, don't get into trouble, don't do anything, please, be safe, protect yourself. So there was part of them that was like really protected, but then they were feeling the sense of injustice and this sense that they had to do something. So the workshops themselves, where they would practice what it was like to sit at a lunch counter and have somebody come with a cigarette and put it out in your hair, right? And they practice listening to people, yelling things at them, and practice just going limp when they were knocked down. So they practiced it, and then it happened. It happened, and they were prepared for it just because they had practiced what it was. John Lewis says in the film, the first time I was arrested, I felt so free, because it was for him, it was a breaking of that bondage of, his family saying, don't get into trouble, don't do anything, don't get in the way. And he was internalizing this, and, for the first time got in the way, and then felt like this amazing sense of release when it happened. And do you remember also in the film, all those high school kids, they get out of their classrooms, and they're marching to the lunch counters because they're going to do a sit-in, and they're encountered with the fire hoses and the dogs, and they're put into the paddy wagons, and they're taken off to jail. It's for John, it was taking something that seemed so awful, having your picture taken as a mugshot and you're put into jail, and turning that into a victory, and into a place to be. And so for him, it was liberation, and for the others, but they couldn't have done it all by themselves. I mean, they really felt strongly that they needed the group. I heard Betty Mae Fikes talk about this recently. She's another one. She's an African-American singer. And she just talked about the fact that she felt such an envelope of love at her church when she's singing with the other women. They gave her the armor, to be able to take these stands that they knew they wanted to take and they had to take, and they took together.
I love the way she describes it as armor. Nonviolent movement, but their protection is love, meeting hate with love, and this is I think a lot of people are interested in this role of faith and how it's playing out today, and I just wonder if on the pilgrimage, did people speak to, I don't think we had in that year Black Lives Matter as a hashtag, but did people speak to the connection between the fight for justice, pursuit of justice today, and what it was like 50 years ago?
When I was on the pilgrimage those two times, not so much, only because it wasn't quite as vivid as it is right now. I think a pilgrimage right now with Black Lives Matter would be extraordinary, just to be able to see the two things. But I think really the magic of the film in contemporary times is to look at that history and to look at the way those young activists stood up to it, and then to talk to your fellow parishioners or your colleagues or your family about what's happening now. And looking at who's out there in the streets. I mean, it's a rainbow mix of people that are out marching, but within our own families, I think there are so many divisions that this whole conversation about racial justice and equality and tactics that one needs to take to call attention to it can cause a lot of very heated arguments. And actually, I think one of the beautiful gifts of the film is to be a catalyst for those conversations today, you know, so that people can talk about some really hurtful things and some painful things that are happening in our lives today, and to use the history as a point of departure, and to look at that 10 years, you know, as just an example of how people did stand up and what they did together, what they did collectively.
Well, I can attest to what you've just said about it being a catalyst for conversation. I watched it again. I'd watched it a few years ago, but I watched it on Friday night with my parents, and my mom had gone on the pilgrimage one time. And what I can say for those of you who will use it in your family as a catalyst, it's an hour-long film, but we had an hour and a half long conversation after the film. And a lot of it did have to do with what resonates with today, what's different from today, and where is that sense of faith, either from the movement or the allies of the movement. Like, what role is faith playing today? And somebody, I just want to let everybody know that the link to the film is going to remain open. Robin has generously said that we can view it for, I don't know what the period of time will be, but enough time to give everybody an opportunity to watch this with your parents, your children, your grandchildren, to spark some conversation.
I have to tell you, it was the invitation for me to come to this group and to talk about the film that reignited my interest in ways that we can use this film today, right? I mean, the film was released in 2009. That seems so long ago. And this new film has come out on John Lewis, and I thought, well, that's going to be the only, nobody else needs a second film. But I was so happy to see that the film could be a companion to that. So just the invitation to come and to talk with you has sparked something in me. And what I'd like to do is leave that link up so that each of you can use it when you want to. And I want to ask each of you to create your own small screening groups, right? I mean, it could be family. I've got one girlfriend that's showing it to a mom's group. I've got other people that are showing it to just, you know, different affinity groups that they have. But it's a little thing. It's like a little screening. You're going to control it in the sense of you're going to bring the film to the select group of people, but then ask for the conversation. You know, this morning in morning prayer, I think it was Suzanne was saying, you know, I'm just so frustrated that I just wish that there was something I could be doing, right? We all want to be doing. Well, having a conversation about these really hurtful issues is doing something. I mean, we really have to start by listening. We have to start by feeling. We have to start by talking to one another about what it really means. So I'm inviting each of you to help develop what I'm going to call an impact campaign. That's something that documentary filmmakers are always talking about. We're going to create an impact campaign. But we're doing it in a smaller way. And I'm going to just ask you to share this film and to open up conversations with other people. We shared it years ago with the 8th graders at Holy Trinity School. And those kids were so moved by the Birmingham part of the story, right? The fire hoses and the dogs. And I told them that I was actually going to be going down to a museum in Birmingham, and I was going to meet some of those kids who are now like in their 50s and 60s. And if they had any questions that they wanted to ask these kids, they could write them down for me. So the teacher, had them all writing these questions. I got this wonderful stack of questions that I was able to take down to the former students who were having a reunion to remember what that time was like. And mostly the kids just wanted to know what it felt like to be in that jail and how they told their parents, right? I mean, I think that sort of comes back to that initial impetus for John Lewis to suddenly not be the good boy, that his parents expected, to get into trouble, to get in the way, but for it to be good trouble. And so our 8th graders, they saw that. They saw that and they wanted to know more about it. So again, it's those kinds of conversations that I'm just inviting each of you to help stimulate.
I think you are onto something, Robin, about listening to how people felt during the movement, how it felt, and their experiences. And, John Lewis says, "Come walk in my shoes." And that's such a good message for today, because a lot of times people want to jump to policy and solutions. And what you said is it's time to listen to each other, to listen to people's experiences, to listen to what it is like to be Black in America today and 50 years ago. But hearing the stories, the narrative, the personal experiences, I think your film helps open the heart, because we're hearing people's testimony and their story and how they got involved. And that is a model for what we can be doing today in conversation. And sort of to open this conversation, I want to encourage any of you on this call to write in the chat box comments or questions. We've had a few, and I've tried to weave them through. And while you're thinking about that, I want to read a comment, and maybe this will prompt something from you, Robin, or others. And it's this comment about Black Lives Matter compared to the civil rights movement. And it's Nadine says this: "This seems to be prayer," this being the Black Lives Matter movement, "this seems to be prayer through action, both for Robin creating the film and the historical characters who affected change growing out of their faith life. Now, people do not necessarily go to a church, but they are still spiritual. So it seems that Black Lives Matter may be prayer in the modern sense of action, to call out better selves, especially the kids who are there. So it's not much different now," is a comment that's made. So I'm wondering if that prompts anything in any of you, or in you, Robin, about that.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment, that is prayer through action. I mean, the beloved community is a whole community. It's everybody. And one of the gifts of being up close with these activists that were very active during the civil rights movement was to hear them describe that need to get rid of racism, because it was a disease, in the lives of white people, and that everybody benefits from this. I mean, the person who is able to recognize the racism and shed the racism and change is also transformed in a very, very important way. And on one of the recent news programs, I heard a young man who was talking about, what was going on today. And he actually used the term that racism is a disease. And he said, if a doctor comes to you and says, you have cancer, and here's what we're going to do to get rid of the cancer, you're not going to beat up that doctor. But if somebody comes to you and says, racism is a disease, and here's what we need to do, you know, to recognize it and to shed it, that shouldn't be met with anger, right? Mm-hmm. That should be met with joy.
What a great insight. This is to everyone, but Dorothy Farley really appreciated, and she'll think about your insight regarding nonviolence, how nonviolence drew the hatred out, pulled it out so it could be seen. And as you mentioned, the power of photographs and film to capture that, to move the hearts of others toward change. So here's a question for you related to this prayer in action. Some members of the civil rights movement say that prayer grounded their freedom from fear, even contemplative prayer. And so in the making of the film, we heard about the song and prayer, but did anyone discuss that contemplative prayer or the inspiration of Gandhi's nonviolent movement in the Pilgrims?
My prompter here is reminding me Martin Luther King was very, very influenced, you know, by the other movements, and specifically by Gandhi, and brought that to the fore. I mean, I think the fact that so many of the mass meetings where, you know, the organizing was happening, these were taking place in churches, and that it was part of church services, that I don't think you would see among the activists a real separation between their faith and what was driving them spiritually and these actions. I have to tell you that, again, this is a personal insight, but in the early years when I was working on all my films, and I was working with homeless children and incarcerated women and intergenerational violence and all kinds of things, that I never put a spiritual I never had a spiritual lens on it, and I was much more like a secular humanist, right, looking at these things. And it was when I went through RCIA and when the Catholic Church opened up to me and I started thinking about social justice as a real component of my faith and who I am, that I was able to bring that to my work. So even though I didn't recognize it, I didn't name it in the beginning, it's something that I came to see and to understand. And I'm able to look back now and just say, I see hope in all my stories. I see people that are talking about transformation and change and a better way to be.
It's lovely to hear about how your own faith journeys dovetailed with these films that you've made to amplify voices. And, you know, you talked about how young people like John Lewis, who was 19, I think he was even younger when he first met Martin Luther King, and then he was 23 when he spoke at the March on Washington, an amazing thing. And so Judith has this thought experiment that she put in the chat box to think about 15 to 25-year-olds seeing this film today, you know, per your suggestion to show it among family members, but particularly that cohort, because those were the ages of the kids in Birmingham were junior high and high school, the leaders of the movement, college students, and Martin Luther King not much older. And so it would be interesting to know whether the kids today, like those 8th graders you talked about, see themselves. Are they angry? Not more happened? And do they feel compelled now to use a different technique? And you can't necessarily answer that question.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful question to ask.
Yeah. Yep. Now, somebody wanted to know about Bob Zellner, who
yes.
Was quite a character, the son of and grandson of KKK members. Do you know much about him and how he got involved, or what his motivation was for getting involved beyond what
Well, again, I mean, I thought he laid it out just beautifully in the film, that he was given a paper to write, right? And in the course of writing the paper, they want to meet Rosa Parks, and they want to meet Martin Luther King, and they did it. You know, they went and they did it, and then they got themselves into a situation that actually brought terror to their campus. You know, Bob Zellner he's a wonderful personality. He actually had a film done. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of it, about his experiences. You know, but to be a white student and active in the movement at the level that he was quite extraordinary. And, you know, once again, standing up to his parents, right? if your dad's, he even talked about, you know, finding the sheet once, you know, seeing the garb that his father wore, and how difficult that was and how powerful that was. So yeah, I think that Bob tells a story in a way that connects with people who feel like they're not connecting with the story. It's not about me.
Yeah.
Well, it is, you know, and that he gives you just a wonderful window into that. So he was a great part of the mix of the personalities that John Lewis made sure that the people who are on this pilgrimage could spend time with, you know, and could hear from.
So here's a question. How can we, particularly with the youth as our audience, because they do learn through film these days more than written content, it seems, how can we continue elevating stories of women of faith, women of color, who get in the way, especially as a Catholic community? And I'm going to just add on to that question. Are we missing the strong voices from Christian pulpits, giving voice to the fight for racial justice? Is there a lack of outcry, as there was 50 years ago among these Christian communities, Catholics included? So it's sort of, is it missing? How can that voice be heard, especially women and women of color? And that's a question for all of us.
Yeah, that's a beautiful call to action for all of us. You know, in the process of listening and then sharing the stories, you know, taking that what we hear and sharing it with others. And again, I come back to, you know, my invitation to use the film as a catalyst for conversation. You know, I mean, the Parkland students, the kids who are so vocal about gun violence, I mean, they're high school students. There's going to be a big film coming out about them within the next couple of months. There are a lot of young activists who are doing amazing things. And I think it's just so scattered that we're not really seeing it in the same way that, you know, we could see a Martin Luther King because he was a Martin Luther King and so visible. But Dorothy Cotton said, you know, I don't want you to think he did it alone. You know, there were a lot of us who were there with him and that were doing this. So I think that there are, Black Lives Matter and other movements, a lot of young people who are, you know, being like that young John Lewis and speaking age 23, you know, to huge crowds. And especially the women, yeah. So it's just, we need to, when we hear the voices, we need to let other people know that these are women who are speaking. These are stories that need to be heard and to share them.
And you know, to your point about amplifying voices that haven't been heard, you know, a lot of people don't think about the women and women of color who were real leaders. So just putting Dorothy Cotton and Betty Mae Fikes out there does such a great service in terms of broadening our notion about who was and who is now currently called to be leaders in the ongoing civil rights movement and movement for Black Lives Matter.
So I have a sense that we are about to conclude with the time, but I just want to reiterate something. The reason we didn't show any clips from the film or highlight it in the music is that the Zoom platform is not ideal for that, right? So we try to show a video and it would be jumping and buffering and not playing very well, which is why I ask if people could do homework, right? And take a look at the film in advance. And if you haven't seen the film yet, maybe this conversation will encourage you to want to see it. And to see it more than once. I mean, it's a very powerful hour because so much is distilled into that hour. You know, it is a decade. It is all these lives that were so moved and changed and transformed that it's the fact that it is an hour is a gift, a true gift. So I thank you for inviting me to share my personal journey in the making of the film, but I want you to use the film, you know, and don't be afraid to reach out to me and ask about ways you can do this, or even to share with me what it is you're learning, because it's all part of the process.
Thank you, Robin. It is a great film, and it really does spark all sorts of thinking. And it sparked people to make some recommendations on the chat box. You can read Bob Zellner's book, Wrong Side of Murder Creek. You can read John Lewis's memoir, Walking in with the Wind, which is a beautiful, beautiful book. It's gripping. And there's a New York Times article on teen girls that are involved in Black Lives Matter and their leadership. So these are just a few things that we can turn to amplify these voices and learn something and hear their stories. John Lewis also wrote a trilogy, which is what's that?
It's a graphic novel.
Thank you.
Graphic novel. Yeah, and it was aimed for children, but it's wonderful. And all his stories, from the I Preach to the Chickens,
yeah,
you know, all the way through what happened on the bridge, they're there for the kids as well.
Yeah, so yeah, turn to John Lewis as a source for how to turn hate into love, to meet it with love, which is something he continues to do to this day. So, and you too, Robin. This was an act of love. It was an act of faith that has a really positive impact that you've put into the world. So you are one of these women who's getting in the way with the way you know how.
Putting my films in the way. And again, thank you for the invitation to do this, because it really did reinvigorate me to do some more work in impact around this film. So thank you.
Thank you. And I hope that you all will join us for the rest of our sessions. And maybe you can give a little sneak preview of what's to come.
Oh, absolutely. So let me add my great gratitude to Robin and to Bill, whom I've known for quite a while now. And Robin and I share our home state of Ohio, so we get to share stories about that periodically. So next week, we will be joined by Sister Christine Schenk, who is co-founder of Future Church, which has been around for probably, I think, 30 years or more. Kind of really, always sort of pushing church to really come into the fullness of who we ought to be. Future Church has been doing that kind of work for a long time. So Sister Christine Schenk also has her master's degree from Georgetown, so we're welcoming Ahoya in our midst next week. She will talk about her book, Christina and Her Sisters, the authority of women in the early church. So we look forward to that conversation with Sister Christine. And then the following week, we will have Professor Sean Copeland with us, who's Professor Emerita at Boston College, a theologian, has contributed greatly to the body of theology, particularly around concerns of African Americans. And she will be discussing a recent book of hers about an African American religious sister. So you need to RSVP for each of the events. So Ashley sends lots of reminders about that to your Holy Trinity communications. Just make sure that you RSVP for each so that you get the link and any other information that you need to have. So with that, we want to respect people's time. And then again, if you want to applaud Robin, you can do so. There are those little reactions down at the bottom of your screen. You can do this.
I love it. Thank you so much. This was very special for me. Thank you.
You're special.
Thank you, Robin.
You are special, Robin. Thank you.
Thanks,
All
Robin.
right. So with that, we will bid you good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. It was a wonderful film.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thanks again,
Thank
Rob.
you.